Once a police officer named Jake Simmons was very rude to a black man, but the black man was the newly appointed chief of police. Then what happened to the racist police officer will surprise you. After hearing this story, no police officer will dare to misbehave with anyone. Before we dive into the main story, if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their skin color, hit the subscribe button. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. May God bless you and your family. Now, without further delay, let's get into the story. It was a warm afternoon when Officer Jake Simmons pulled over a black car on the edge of Main Street. The car had been speeding, just a little too fast, and Simmons, who prided himself on being quick to act, immediately turned on his siren. The car skidded to the side, and Simmons stepped out of his patrol car with his hand resting on his holster. The driver, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit, stepped out of the car slowly. He didn't seem nervous, which made Simmons even more irritated. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Simmons said, his tone sharp, a little condescending. The man nodded, his face calm. "Yes, officer. I was speeding." Simmons eyed him, clearly noticing his fancy suit, his expensive watch. Something about the man's composure didn't sit right with him. It was almost like he thought he was above being pulled over. "You're speeding through here like you're in some fancy race, huh? Got somewhere important to be?" Simmons asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he looked Simmons in the eyes and said, "I do, but that's no excuse. I'll accept the ticket." Simmons narrowed his eyes. "You think you're too good for this? You probably think you can buy your way out of anything, huh?" The man remained silent for a moment, his eyes still steady on Simmons. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "Actually, I think I'll just introduce myself. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm the new chief of police." Simmons froze. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment he stood there, unable to move or speak. Chief Michael Thompson. The man he had just insulted, the one he had tried to belittle, was the new head of the entire police department? Thompson took a slow step forward, his eyes meeting Simmons's, challenging him silently. "I understand you're doing your job, but you need to treat people with respect. That's the job, not just handing out tickets or throwing your weight around." Thompson's voice was firm but calm. "I'll take this conversation up with your supervisor, but I suggest you think carefully about how you treat others." Simmons's face reddened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to get called out by someone in such a position of power. "Chief or not, that's not how we do things here," Simmons muttered under his breath, but Thompson had already turned and walked back to his car. As the black car drove away, Simmons stood still for a moment, his thoughts spinning. He had just insulted the new chief of police, the man who was supposed to lead the department. But what bothered him most wasn't the mistake he had just made. It was the unsettling feeling that deep down, he knew he was wrong. And that thought made him angry. The next morning, Simmons walked into the police station with a heavy feeling in his chest. His encounter with Chief Michael Thompson had been playing on his mind all night. He knew he'd crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. In the back of his mind, he told himself that Thompson was just another leader, another suit behind a desk. He didn't know what it was like out there on the streets. Simmons walked past the front desk, nodding at a few colleagues, but none of them met his eyes. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he kept his head high, ignoring the tension building in his gut. He pushed open the door to the briefing room, where several officers were gathered around. The moment he stepped in, the room fell silent. Chief Thompson was standing at the front, flipping through a stack of papers. "Officer Simmons." Thompson's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Can we have a word?" Simmons hesitated but nodded and followed him into a small office at the back of the room. The door clicked shut behind them, and Thompson turned to face him. "I've been looking through your file, Simmons," Thompson started. "I've heard complaints. I've read reports. There are patterns here. And frankly, your behavior on the street yesterday doesn't surprise me." Simmons shifted uncomfortably, but he wasn't going to let Thompson see how much the words hurt. "It was a misunderstanding, Chief. The man was acting arrogant. He was speeding. I stopped him, and he thought he could just walk away like he was above the law." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Arrogant?" The man was calm. He was polite, and yet, you assumed because he was black, because of his clothes? What, you thought you could just talk down to him? Simmons felt his chest tighten. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just doing my job. Thompson's gaze was unflinching. Your job is to serve and protect, Simmons, to treat people with respect. And what I saw yesterday wasn't respect. It was racism. It was bias. And that's something I won't tolerate in this department. Simmons swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Thompson took a step closer, his voice lowering but growing more intense. I know what's happening here, Simmons. This department's been broken for a long time. People like you, people who believe they have the power to control others with fear and aggression, have been running things for years. I'm not going to let that continue. Not while I'm chief. Simmons's face flushed with anger, but Thompson continued, his voice steady. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make change. If you can't adapt to that, if you can't follow the rules and treat everyone equally, then maybe you don't belong here anymore. For a long moment, Simmons stood silent, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to lash out, to tell Thompson he was overstepping, but a part of him, a small, hidden part, knew Thompson was right. He had crossed a line. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't shake the feeling that the way he treated people had been wrong for a long time. You're dismissed, Thompson said, his tone not unkind but firm. Simmons nodded, turning sharply and leaving the office. He felt a wave of frustration surge through him, but there was something else, too. Something nagging at him, something that felt like guilt. And the more he thought about it, the more it made his stomach turn. As he walked back to the briefing room, he saw his fellow officers chatting in small groups. They looked at him briefly, but no one said anything. It was clear the air had shifted. No one was sure how to act around him anymore. Simmons sat at his desk, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him, but his mind kept wandering back to that conversation with Thompson. He had just been called out, and the weight of it was heavier than he cared to admit. But the idea of change, the idea of a chief who wouldn't let things slide, was starting to sink in. Maybe things were about to change for all of them. But the question Simmons couldn't answer was, would he be able to change with them? The days following the confrontation in Thompson's office were tense. Simmons couldn't shake the feeling that the other officers were watching him, waiting for him to mess up again. It wasn't just the unease in the air. It was the subtle glances, the whispers that stopped when he entered the room, the way people seemed to distance themselves when he walked by. Chief Thompson's presence had become a constant reminder of the shift that was happening within the department. It wasn't just a matter of policies changing. It was a shift in culture, in how they viewed their roles. And that terrified Simmons. On the outside, Simmons tried to maintain his usual bravado. He went through the motions, answered calls, wrote reports, made arrests, but inside, he was unraveling. The pressure to change was mounting, but he didn't know how to let go of the habits that had been ingrained in him for years. One afternoon, as Simmons was finishing up a routine shift, he ran into Officer Rachel Davis, a younger officer who had been with the department for a few years. She was a bright, ambitious woman who seemed to support the changes Thompson was trying to implement. She was one of the few people who had openly backed the chief, and it made Simmons uneasy. Hey, Jake, got a minute? Rachel's voice was friendly, but there was an edge to it, like she knew something was off. Yeah, what's up? Simmons muttered, avoiding eye contact as he shuffled papers on his desk. I just wanted to check in. You okay? You've been a little off lately, she said, her tone genuine but cautious. Simmons shrugged, trying to mask the turmoil inside. Just tired. You know how it is. Same old, same old. Rachel wasn't convinced. Listen, I know things have been different around here, but it's for the better, right? Chief Thompson is pushing for real change. He's trying to fix the things that have been broken for a long time. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew Rachel was right. He knew what Thompson was trying to do was important, that it could help rebuild trust in the community. But it wasn't easy. The culture of the department had been shaped by years of certain attitudes and behaviors, and changing that wasn't going to happen overnight. I don't know, Rachel, Simmons said quietly, his voice lower than usual. I've been doing this job for a long time, and it feels like everything's changing, and I don't know if I'm ready for all that. Rachel sat down across from him, her eyes softening. You're not the only one feeling that way, Jake. Change is hard for all of us, but if we want to be better, we have to start somewhere. Chief Thompson is giving us that opportunity. Don't let your pride get in the way. Simmons looked up at her, his gaze filled with conflict. It's not just pride, it's... He paused, searching for the right words. It's the way things have always been. People like Thompson, they don't understand what it's like out there. They don't understand how tough it can get. Rachel nodded, but she didn't back down. I get it. But that's why we need people like you, Jake. People with experience. People who can help change things from the inside, not just complain about it. Thompson's giving us a chance to make things right. We don't get many chances like that. Simmons felt the weight of her words settle on him. It wasn't just about doing the job anymore. It was about doing the job right, about doing it with respect, dignity, and fairness. And he couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, that's what he wanted too. But he wasn't sure he was ready to give up the old ways, those instincts that had kept him going all these years. Before he could respond, Thompson walked into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room went silent, and Simmons stood up instinctively, but Rachel remained seated, her eyes locked on Thompson. I need everyone to gather in the briefing room in 15 minutes, Thompson announced. We have some important changes to discuss. Simmons felt his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. More policies, more initiatives, more pressure. But he also knew that this time, it was going to be different. Thompson wasn't just giving orders. He was pushing for a transformation that would affect every officer, every decision they made, every way they interacted with the community. As the officers filed into the briefing room, Simmons stayed near the back. He avoided eye contact with Thompson, still feeling the weight of their last conversation. The chief began to speak, his voice steady and unwavering. We're making changes here, officers. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about restoring trust. We are not just enforcers of the law. We are public servants. That means we have to act with integrity, with respect, and with a clear understanding of our biases. Simmons listened, his arms crossed over his chest. He could hear the sincerity in Thompson's voice, but it still felt like a threat to everything he had known. The system that had worked for him, at least in his mind, was being dismantled piece by piece. We are launching a new initiative, Thompson continued, focused on sensitivity training, de-escalation tactics, and building relationships with the communities we serve. I expect full participation from every officer. We're also opening an anonymous reporting system for misconduct. No one is above accountability. A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Simmons could see some of the other officers exchanging looks. They weren't thrilled about these new policies either. It was a tough pill to swallow, especially for those who had been in the department long enough to feel entitled to their methods. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, his eyes landing briefly on Simmons. I know change is difficult, but we have to rise to the occasion. This department has a chance to lead the way, to show the community that we are not the enemy. We are here to protect and serve. Simmons felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just the chief's words. It was the realization that the way he had done his job for so long was no longer enough, and that he might have to change whether he was ready or not. The following weeks were a blur of training sessions, meetings, and uncomfortable silences in the break room. Simmons couldn't escape the feeling that he was caught between two worlds, one where power was exercised with fear and dominance, and another where respect, accountability, and change were becoming the new norm. It was exhausting, and for the first time in his career, Simmons wasn't sure if he was cut out for the job anymore. The sensitivity training was the hardest for him. It forced him to confront things he had always dismissed as just the way things were. He had spent years telling himself that law enforcement had to be tough, that tough love was the only language people understood. But as the training sessions continued, Simmons was forced to listen to stories from officers who had faced their own biases and learned to overcome them. He was faced with his own reflections in the words of others, and it was uncomfortable, to say the least. One afternoon, after another grueling de-escalation workshop, Simmons found himself in the parking lot, leaning against his car. His head was spinning. He needed a break, but he also couldn't escape the nagging voice in the back of his mind. What if this wasn't just a phase? What if Thompson was right? He rubbed his temples, frustrated with himself. His old habits and instincts fought against everything he was learning. The idea of being vulnerable in his job, of admitting mistakes, felt like a betrayal to everything he had believed in for years. As he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. "Meeting at my place after work. We need to talk." Simmons stared at the message, then typed back a quick response. "About what?" "You'll see. Just come." He didn't know what to expect, but he found himself driving to Rachel's apartment later that evening, a strange mix of curiosity and unease swirling inside him. When he arrived, Rachel was sitting at her kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her, but her expression was serious. "Sit down, Jake," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Simmons took a seat, his stomach twisting. "What's going on?" Rachel didn't waste time. "I've been hearing things, Jake. People are talking about you." Simmons frowned. "Talking about me? What do you mean?" "Not in a good way," Rachel replied, her voice soft but firm. "You're starting to isolate yourself. People are noticing. They're seeing the way you're pushing back, the way you're resisting everything Thompson is trying to do. I'm worried about you." Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want to face it, but deep down, he knew Rachel was right. He had been shutting everyone out. "I don't belong in this new department, Rachel," Simmons muttered. "I can't just pretend like everything's fine. This isn't how things are supposed to be." Rachel leaned forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "You've got to stop thinking that way. The department needs you, Jake. More than ever. You've got the experience. You've been through the tough calls, the bad situations. That's why Thompson's pushing you. But you have to meet him halfway. He's trying to make things better for the community, for the department. You can't keep resisting this." Simmons opened his mouth to argue, but Rachel stopped him with a raised hand. "I know you're not happy with all these changes. I get it. But you can't keep going down this road. It's going to eat you alive, and it's going to destroy everything you've worked for." For a long moment, Simmons said nothing. The weight of her words settled on him, heavy and undeniable. He felt the truth in them, but it was painful to accept. He had spent his whole career using his power to control the situation, to make people fall in line. And now? Now he was being asked to change everything, to question everything he knew. "I don't know if I can change, Rachel," Simmons said quietly. "I don't know if I'm ready for it." Rachel sighed, standing up and walking over to the window. "None of us are ready, Jake. But sometimes we don't get a choice. You can either embrace this and be a part of the solution, or you can stay stuck in the past and let it destroy you." Simmons's chest tightened. He had been so focused on what he was losing, the power, the certainty, that he hadn't realized what he could gain. He hadn't realized the opportunity in front of him to help change the very system he had once believed was untouchable. To make a difference, to be the kind of officer who didn't just follow orders, but led with integrity and respect. "What if I mess up?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Rachel turned back to him, her eyes warm but serious. "We all mess up, Jake. It's what you do after you mess up that matters." The words hung in the air between them, and Simmons found himself staring down at his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. Maybe this wasn't all about giving up the past. Maybe it was about building something new, something better. But he couldn't do it alone. "I'll try," he said finally, the words feeling foreign but necessary. Rachel smiled, her expression softening. That's all anyone can ask for. As Simmons stood to leave, he felt a shift inside him. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would be setbacks. But maybe, just maybe, he could be part of something that could finally make a difference. The next few days passed in a blur of conflicting emotions for Simmons. He was more aware than ever of the tension within the department. There were murmurs of dissatisfaction, particularly among the older officers who felt threatened by the changes Chief Thompson was pushing for. Simmons, though, had made a quiet decision. He was going to try. He was going to meet Thompson halfway. even if it meant breaking through years of ingrained habits. The opportunity to prove himself came sooner than he expected. It was late one afternoon when a call came in about a domestic disturbance on the outskirts of town. Simmons and Rachel were assigned to the case. As they pulled up to the house, Simmons couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. He had been on countless similar calls, all of them escalating into shouting matches, tense standoffs, and more than a few close calls. His instincts told him to brace for the worst, to rely on his experience to control the situation. But as they approached the front door, Rachel spoke up. "Remember the training, Jake. De-escalation first. If we can keep it calm, we don't need to make this worse." Simmons nodded, but felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure he could trust this new approach yet, not in a situation like this. The door opened, and a man, visibly agitated, stood in the doorway. His hands were clenched into fists, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, a woman stood nervously, wringing her hands. The man shouted as soon as he saw the officers. "What the hell do you want? You think you can just barge in here and tell me what to do?" Simmons felt his old instincts flare up. His first reaction was to match the man's anger, to assert control over the situation. But then he remembered Rachel's words. De-escalation first. Taking a deep breath, Simmons stepped forward, keeping his posture open but non-threatening. "Sir, we're here to help. Nobody's looking to make this worse. We just want to make sure everyone's safe." The man sneered. "Safe? You think I'm going to listen to you? You don't know what I've been through." Rachel stepped in then, her voice calm but firm. "We understand you're upset, but yelling isn't going to help. We're here to listen. If you're angry, let us know why. We'll help however we can." The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But then he took a shaky breath and stepped back from the door. "Fine, but you better listen." Simmons exchanged a quick look with Rachel. It was working. Slowly, gently, they managed to calm the man down, to talk to him without escalating the situation further. The woman, now visibly relieved, joined in, speaking quietly to her partner, helping him understand the gravity of the situation without shouting. Eventually, the man agreed to sit down and talk about what had led to the argument. No one was arrested, no one was hurt, and the officers were able to mediate the situation peacefully. It wasn't perfect, and Simmons still felt the tight grip of his old methods in his chest, but it was progress. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of pride in how the situation had been handled. As they walked back to their patrol car, Rachel smiled at Simmons. "That went well. You did good." Simmons hesitated before responding. "Yeah, I guess I did, but it still doesn't feel right, you know? It's hard to let go of what I've always known." Rachel nodded. "I get it, but this is how we're going to make real change. By listening, by being patient. We don't need to be the bad guys." Simmons thought about her words as they drove back to the station. We don't need to be the bad guys. He had always been so focused on maintaining authority, on asserting control. But what if being in control wasn't about power? What if it was about respect? Back at the station, Thompson called a quick meeting to debrief the officers on the day's events. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though there was still a weight to his words when he spoke. "You did well today," Thompson told them, his eyes landing on Simmons. "You showed patience, restraint, and, most importantly, you kept the situation from escalating. That's what I expect from every officer here. It's not always easy, but it's the right way to do this job." Simmons could feel his chest swell with a rare sense of accomplishment. It was the first time Thompson had openly acknowledged his efforts in a positive light. It felt different, good, even, but there was still so much left to do. He was starting to realize that the road to change wasn't going to be quick. It was going to take more than just a few days of trying. It was going to take years of consistently doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Later that evening, Simmons found himself alone in the break room, replaying the call in his mind. It hadn't been perfect. He had slipped up a few times, his frustration almost getting the better of him. But it was a start. As he was lost in thought, Rachel entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Simmons and sat down next to him. "You're quiet," she said, raising an eyebrow. Simmons smiled faintly. "Just thinking about how much I've been doing this wrong all these years." Rachel chuckled softly. We all get there eventually. The important thing is that you're willing to change. Simmons took a sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he had all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to keep trying. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I am." Simmons woke up the next morning with a strange sense of resolve. The success from the previous day's call had faded into a quiet sense of pride, but today felt different. Today, the cracks in his old armor, those walls he had built up around his authority, his instincts, seemed wider. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to patch them up. At the station, however, things were still tense. Chief Thompson was pushing ahead with the changes, and while Simmons had made a conscious decision to try, the resistance was palpable. Officers who had been in the department for decades weren't hiding their discontent. There was a low hum of dissent among them, just under the surface, that made Simmons uneasy. As he walked through the hallways, he overheard snippets of conversations. Frustrated officers questioning the new policies, muttering about the chief's soft approach to law enforcement. Some even openly scoffed at the sensitivity training, calling it a waste of time. Simmons tried to ignore it, but he couldn't deny the tension that hung in the air. He had felt it too. The pull to go back to the old ways, to find comfort in the certainty of control. His first task of the day was an internal review of a use-of-force incident that had occurred a few weeks earlier. It was a standard procedure, but the atmosphere in the room made it anything but routine. Simmons sat at the head of the table, surrounded by officers from different ranks. Everyone was quiet, waiting for Thompson to speak. When he finally did, his voice was calm but firm. "We need to be transparent with this," Thompson said, his eyes scanning the room. "This incident is part of a larger issue. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, the community will never trust us. I expect everyone here to be honest about what happened and what we can do better." Simmons had seen this kind of thing before, reviews that were more about covering up mistakes than truly addressing them. But Thompson wasn't like the others. He didn't just want to check a box. He wanted change. Simmons felt a small knot form in his stomach as he looked around the room. Some officers seemed uneasy, others more defensive. One officer, Sergeant Donnelly, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for being by the book, spoke up. "I'm not sure I understand why we're revisiting this. We did what we had to do. The guy resisted arrest, and we took him down. End of story." Simmons stiffened. He had been part of similar situations before, but now, with Thompson's new emphasis on accountability and community trust, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. Thompson didn't flinch. "That's not good enough anymore, Donnelly. It's never just about whether we can do something. It's about whether we should. Every action we take needs to be justified, especially in a situation like this." There was a brief silence as the words hung in the air. Simmons could feel the tension rising, the unease building, but he also felt something else, the beginning of a shift. It was subtle, but it was there. Thompson wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Simmons cleared his throat, speaking up for the first time. "Chief's right. We need to start holding ourselves to a higher standard, not just because it's what's expected of us, but because it's what's right." The room was quiet for a moment, and Simmons felt all eyes on him. He had expected resistance, but it still stung. Sergeant Donnelly narrowed his eyes at Simmons but didn't say anything. It was clear he didn't agree, but the silence was deafening. The old Simmons would have pushed back, would have fought to uphold the status quo. But this Simmons, this new version, was beginning to understand the weight of what Thompson was trying to do. And he knew it was important. After the meeting, Simmons found himself walking alone in the parking lot, lost in thought. The weight of his words hung in the air. It's what's right. It felt strange to admit it, but he was beginning to see that the old ways weren't right anymore. Not just for the community, but for him as an officer. What's the point of all the power, all the control, if it's built on fear? As he reached his car, he was interrupted by a voice from behind him. "Hey, Simmons." He turned to see Officer Daniels, one of the younger officers who had been quietly watching the shift happen in the department. Daniels had been one of the few officers who seemed to truly embrace the changes, and Simmons could tell he wasn't just following Thompson's lead out of obligation. He believed in it. I heard what you said in the meeting today, Daniels said, his tone casual but respectful. That's the kind of thing we need more of. Honestly, it's not easy to speak up like that. Simmons shrugged, feeling uncomfortable under the younger man's praise. I don't know. It just felt like the right thing to do. I'm not sure I'm even getting this whole change thing right. Daniels gave him a small grin. None of us have it figured out yet, but it's good to see someone with experience actually trying. Simmons didn't respond immediately, his mind still racing with everything he had said and done that day. It was easier to stay in the comfortable space of silence and authority, to retreat into the version of himself that had worked for so long. But today, for the first time in years, he didn't want to. Thanks, Daniels, Simmons said after a long pause. I guess I'm starting to understand what it means to lead, not with control, but with respect. Daniels nodded, as if he'd heard these words many times before, but it still felt significant. That's exactly it. As Simmons got into his car, he glanced at the station behind him. There were still so many challenges ahead, so many officers who resisted, so many years of old habits to undo. But for the first time, Simmons felt like he might be part of the solution. He wasn't there yet, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, he could help lead this department into the future, one small step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, that future felt like a didn't seem so for Simmons. The resistance from the older officers had only grown more pronounced. There were whispers in the hallways, looks exchanged in the break room, and the unmistakable tension during every department meeting. Simmons was no stranger to tension, but it felt different now. Before, he had thrived on it, used it to maintain control. Now, it felt like a weight, like something was slowly chipping away at the walls he had carefully built around himself. One morning, as Simmons was heading into the office, he was intercepted by Officer Green, a longtime member of the force and one of the biggest critics of the recent changes. Hey, Simmons, Green said, his voice low but sharp. Got a minute? Simmons stopped, raising an eyebrow. What's up? Green looked around to make sure no one was listening before stepping closer. I don't know what kind of game you're playing with Thompson, but you'd better get your head straight. This isn't going to end well. The guys are starting to talk, and we're all getting tired of the new you. Simmons felt a brief flash of anger, but suppressed it. Green wasn't the first officer to voice discontent, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But this felt different. The challenge wasn't just to his authority, it was a direct challenge to everything he was trying to do. I'm not playing any game, Green, Simmons said, his voice steady. I'm doing my job, and so should you. Green scoffed, clearly not expecting the response. Your job is to keep things running the way they've always been. Don't tell me you've bought into all that community trust nonsense. I haven't bought into anything. I'm just trying to do things better, Simmons replied, standing his ground. Green paused, his eyes narrowing. I don't know if you can do that, Simmons, but mark my words, you're going to lose the respect of this department if you keep up with this. With that, Green turned and walked off, leaving Simmons standing there, shaken but resolute. His mind was racing, but his body felt rooted to the ground. Was he losing the respect of the department? It was hard to say, but in that moment, the weight of what he was trying to do, what he was asking others to do, felt like a mountain too steep to climb. Later that day, Chief Thompson called a meeting for all staff members. Simmons arrived early, sitting near the back of the room. His thoughts were preoccupied with his conversation with Green, but he pushed them aside as Thompson entered. We've got some important issues to address, Thompson began, his tone firm but calm. I've received some concerns about the direction of this department, and I want to make it clear that we're in this together. But change is difficult. It's uncomfortable. And I know some of you are struggling with that. I understand. But that doesn't mean we give up on the goal. Simmons straightened in his chair. There it was again. The idea of community trust, the new approach, the uncomfortable truth that Thompson was trying to force everyone to confront. But Simmons could see it now, even more clearly. It wasn't just about policing. It was about the very fabric of what law enforcement stood for in the community. It was about whether they were going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. I'm not asking for immediate results, Thompson continued. What I'm asking for is patience. I'm asking for each of you to take a hard look at your own actions and behaviors and to hold yourselves accountable. That's what will make us better. After the meeting, Simmons found himself walking alongside Thompson. The chief had been watching him closely over the past few weeks, and Simmons could sense that he was waiting for something. "You doing okay, Jake?" Thompson asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if he understood the weight Simmons was carrying. Simmons hesitated before answering. "It's hard. The resistance, it's not just from the community. It's here too, from people I thought I could count on." Thompson nodded. "I get it. It's never easy to be the one asking for change, especially when it means confronting your own department. But you've already made a big difference, Jake. I've seen it. You're leading by example." Simmons didn't know how to respond to that. The words were nice, but they didn't change the reality he was facing. He didn't know if he could keep going like this. If he was being honest with himself, there were days when he felt like he was swimming against an unrelenting current. But the seed of change had been planted, and no matter how hard it got, he knew he couldn't turn back now. As the day wore on, Simmons was called to the scene of another incident. This time, a traffic stop that had escalated into a violent confrontation. As he arrived, he found two officers standing near a young man who was cuffed and sitting on the curb. The situation was tense, with the man shouting and struggling to break free, while the officers were trying to maintain control. Simmons immediately stepped forward, his instincts telling him to calm the situation down before it went any further. He could see the frustration in the officers' faces, but he also saw the fear in the young man's eyes. Hey, let's take a step back," Simmons said, his voice commanding but calm. "What happened here?" The officer who had initiated the stop looked uneasy. He was speeding, and when we pulled him over, he started getting belligerent. We tried to cuff him, but he resisted. Simmons nodded, eyeing the young man who was now glaring at the officers. "What's your side of the story?" The young man's voice cracked as he spoke. "You guys always do this. You pull me over because I'm black. It's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong." Simmons felt a pang in his chest. The anger in the man's voice, the fear, it was all too familiar. And in that moment, he realized that the change he was fighting for was bigger than just the department. It was about these moments, about how people felt when they interacted with the police. "I'm not here to argue, but I want to make sure we do this right," Simmons said. He turned to the other officers. "Let's de-escalate. No more shouting. Let's get him calmed down, and then we'll talk about next steps." It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But Simmons managed to get the situation under control without further escalation. He let the young man vent his frustration, while the officers stood back and listened. The young man didn't apologize, but when Simmons walked away, he could see a faint sense of relief in the man's eyes. As they walked back to the patrol car, Rachel, who had arrived on scene with him, gave him a small nod. "You did good, Jake." Simmons exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I'm starting to get it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I'm starting to understand what it means to really lead." Rachel didn't say anything more, but Simmons knew she understood. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't even close. But in that moment, he felt like he was on the right path. And that wasn't happening. But it wasn't smooth. It wasn't easy. The tension in the department was reaching its peak. Every step forward felt like it was being met with resistance from the officers who didn't want to let go of the old ways. Simmons could feel it in the air, the quiet hostility from officers like Green and Donnelly, the side glances, the dismissive mutterings in the locker room. And then, everything came to a head. It was late in the evening when the call came in, an armed robbery at a local convenience store. The suspect was still inside, and a standoff was unfolding. The responding officers were already on scene, weapons drawn, waiting for orders. Simmons and Rachel arrived to find the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. The suspect, a young man barely out of his teens, was cornered inside, a gun trembling in his hand. His eyes were wild with fear as he paced near the counter, shouting at the officers outside. Green was there, leading the charge, barking orders into his radio. His stance was aggressive, his finger dangerously close to the trigger of his gun. "We've got a suspect who's resisting. He's armed. We're taking him down." Green's voice was hard, unwavering. Simmons' gut clenched. Something wasn't right. He could see the fear in the kid's eyes. He wasn't some hardened criminal. He was scared, desperate. Rachel leaned in close. We need to de-escalate this before it turns into another tragedy. Simmons nodded and stepped forward, ignoring the weight of Green's glare. Let me talk to him. Green scoffed. Talk? Are you serious? The kid's armed. He's not going to listen to you. Simmons turned to face Green, his voice calm but firm. And what's your plan? Shoot him? Make this another news story? Another reason for people to hate us? Stand down, Green. Green's eyes flashed with something close to fury. You're getting soft, Simmons. No, Simmons said, stepping past him. I'm getting smart. Ignoring the murmurs behind him, he approached the store, hands raised. The kid inside tensed, aiming the gun toward him. Hey, listen to me, Simmons said, keeping his voice level. I don't want anyone to get hurt, all right? I just want to talk. The young man's hands were shaking. They're going to shoot me. I know they are. No one's shooting you, Simmons assured him. But you have to work with me here. Put the gun down and let's talk. The kid's breath was ragged. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Then, finally, he let out a shaky exhale and lowered the weapon. Simmons took slow, measured steps forward and carefully took the gun from the kid's trembling hands. You did the right thing, he said softly. Behind him, he could hear the rustling of officers moving in, handcuffing the kid. He was taken into custody, but no one was hurt. No bullets fired, no blood spilled. As the situation de-escalated, Simmons turned to face the officers. Green was glaring at him, arms crossed, jaw clenched. You just got lucky, Green muttered. Simmons met his gaze head-on. No, I did my job. Green let out a bitter chuckle. Whatever you say, Simmons, but don't think this changes anything. Simmons didn't respond. He didn't need to, because in that moment, he knew he had done the right thing, not the easy thing. Not the thing that would have made him look strong in front of his peers, but the right thing. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what robbery standoff echoed through the department for weeks. The media, of course, latched onto the narrative that Simmons had miraculously talked the armed suspect down, casting him in the role of the hero, the officer who defied the odds and showed restraint. But within the department, the reactions were more complicated. Some officers, including Green, were convinced that Simmons had been too lenient, too afraid to take control. But others, quietly behind closed doors, were beginning to see something in him, something that had been buried under years of hardened policing. Simmons knew he wasn't done yet. He had won one small victory, but the bigger fight for reform was far from over. And each day, he faced the challenge of earning the trust of the officers who still believed in the old ways, while continuing to lead a department in desperate need of change. That morning, Simmons found himself walking into the briefing room for the daily roll call, a sense of unease settling in his chest. Today's meeting was different. Today, Thompson had asked him to speak. As he entered, the room fell silent. The officers, some of whom had been with the department for decades, looked at him expectantly. The weight of their gaze was palpable, but Simmons had learned to handle it. He'd been speaking with the chief for days now about what came next, about how they could shift the culture of the department from within. Simmons cleared his throat, standing at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces before him. We've been through a lot in the past few months, he began. And I know a lot of you are still trying to figure out what kind of department we're going to be. I know there's skepticism, resistance, and fear of change. I get it. But we can't keep doing things the way we have been. We can't ignore the issues, pretend they'll go away on their own. There was a murmur in the room. Simmons could feel the tension, the silent judgments from officers like Green. But he pushed through. We've seen what happens when we don't hold ourselves accountable, Simmons continued. We've seen how it erodes trust between us and the community. And we've seen how it tears apart families, neighborhoods, lives. We have a choice now to continue down the same path or to start building something better, and I choose better. He paused, letting the words settle. A few officers exchanged looks, some appearing thoughtful, others dismissive. We're going to be held accountable, not just by the chief or by the city, but by ourselves. We'll be looking at everything, from the way we interact with people, to the policies we enforce, to how we handle conflict. This isn't going to be easy, but I'm asking you to take a hard look in the mirror and ask yourself, what kind of police officer do you want to be? The room was silent, the air thick with uncertainty. Simmons knew he wasn't going to win everyone over with just words, but he had to start somewhere. He had to plant the seed. When the meeting ended, he left the room with a heavy heart. Some officers had quietly nodded, but Green stood in the back, arms crossed, a tight-lipped smirk on his face. "Nice speech, Simmons," Green called out as Simmons walked by. "But speeches don't change anything." Simmons stopped and looked back at him. "Maybe not, but actions do, and I'm prepared to take them." Green didn't respond, but Simmons could feel the weight of the older officer's disdain. It stung, but he didn't let it shake him. He couldn't afford to. Later that afternoon, Simmons was once again standing before Thompson in his office. The chief was reviewing reports, but he paused when Simmons entered. "You did well today," Thompson said quietly, his voice full of quiet pride. Simmons sat down across from him, his shoulders heavy. "I don't know if it was enough. It felt like they were just waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to lose control." Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "It's going to be like that for a while. Change is never easy, and it's never quick, but you're doing the right thing. You're showing them what leadership really looks like." Simmons sighed. "I hope so. I really do." Thompson's gaze softened. "It won't happen overnight, but it will happen, Jake. You're leading by example, and that's what counts." Simmons nodded, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "I've been thinking a lot about that, Chief, about what kind of police officer I want to be. I used to think it was all about control, about power, but now I see it's about respect, and I'm trying to figure out how to earn that from my team." "You're on the right track," Thompson said with a small smile. "It's not just about you earning their respect. It's about earning the respect of the people you serve. And that starts with honesty, integrity, and accountability. You're showing them that every day. The rest will follow." Simmons felt a surge of gratitude, but also a lingering sense of doubt. It was hard to believe that change could truly take hold when everything around him seemed to fight it so fiercely. But Thompson's words kept him grounded, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone in the battle. That evening, Simmons found himself driving through the city, the quiet streets stretching out before him. His thoughts were still wrapped in the heavy weight of the department's resistance, but his heart was no longer burdened by the weight of the past. He had made his choice, and no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, he would face them with the conviction that he was doing the right thing. As he passed the corner where he had stopped that terrified young man at the robbery, he noticed something, a subtle change in the air. The streets were calmer, quieter, but there was something in the silence that felt different. Maybe it was just the night settling in, or maybe it was the sense that, just maybe, things were starting to shift. In his heart, Simmons knew this was just the beginning. There would be setbacks, challenges, and days where it felt like they were taking 2 steps backward for every 1 step forward. But the road ahead was clear, and he was no longer afraid of walking it. He wasn't perfect, but he was ready, and that was enough. Weeks turned into months, and the simmering tension that had once defined Simmons' every step within the department began to shift. But even though things were changing, the cracks in the foundation still remained. Every victory felt fragile, as if a single misstep could send everything back into chaos. The real test came one afternoon when Simmons and Thompson received a call about an incident at a local protest. Tensions were high in the city, following a series of controversial police actions in neighboring counties, and a large crowd had gathered in the downtown area. What began as a peaceful demonstration quickly escalated into a confrontation between protesters and officers who were still resistant to the department's new direction. Simmons was in his office when the call came in, and without a second thought, he grabbed his gear and rushed to the scene. He knew this was a critical moment. This was where everything they had worked toward could either break or become solidified. As he arrived, he saw the sea of protesters, angry, fearful, and determined. Their chants echoed down the street, and Simmons could hear the distant hum of police radios as officers began to move in. He spotted Thompson near the front lines, his face calm but resolute. There was a palpable tension in the air. Simmons approached, his heart racing. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Thompson turned to face him, his brow furrowed. "They've been protesting for hours now. We've kept things contained, but there's a lot of frustration. The crowd's starting to get agitated. We need to keep them calm. This could escalate if we don't handle it right." Simmons nodded. He could see the fear in the eyes of some of the younger officers, the way they clutched their batons tightly, their hands twitching toward their holsters. These were officers who hadn't yet bought into the idea that things needed to change. "Let's do it," Simmons said, turning toward the line of officers. "We'll approach them peacefully. No more force, no more intimidation. Let's talk first." Green was in the front row of officers, his face twisted in frustration. "You really think this is going to work, Simmons? These people don't want to talk. They want to fight." Simmons stepped up to him, keeping his voice steady. "That's not true, Green. They want to be heard. And if we don't listen, it'll be us who turns this into a fight." Green sneered but didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside as Simmons moved closer to the front of the line. He looked out over the crowd, and for a moment, he saw something different. The protesters weren't all angry. Some of them were exhausted, tired of fighting a system they felt had been stacked against them for far too long. Others were pleading for justice, for change, things that had seemed impossible just a year ago. Simmons took a deep breath and raised his hand. "Listen," he shouted, trying to be heard over the growing noise. "We're here to listen. We're here to talk, not to fight. We understand your anger. We understand your frustration. But we need to work together if we're going to make real change." The crowd fell silent, and Simmons could feel the eyes of both the officers and the protesters on him. It was a moment of fragile hope, one that could easily slip away if it wasn't handled with care. For a long minute, the silence stretched. Then, one voice called out from the crowd. "Are you actually going to change things? Or is this just more empty talk?" Simmons didn't flinch. He'd been asked that question more times than he could count, and each time it weighed on him. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. "We've already started to change," he said, his voice firm. "We've been listening to the community. We're holding ourselves accountable. But it's not enough yet. It's going to take time. But we're committed to it. And I'm asking for your help." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. There was a glimmer of something. Maybe skepticism, maybe hope. But Simmons could feel the tension easing, just a little. He wasn't asking for their forgiveness. He wasn't promising a perfect system overnight, but he was offering a chance at something different, something better. Thompson stepped forward, standing beside Simmons. "This isn't just about one department. It's about rebuilding trust between the police and the community. And we know that we've got a long road ahead, but we will walk it with you." Simmons turned back to the officers. "We can't keep acting like we're in control. This isn't about us versus them. It's about finding a way forward together. It's about real accountability, and it starts now." The protesters didn't all agree, but the majority seemed to accept Simmons's words. There were no more shouts or insults, just a quiet sense of acknowledgement that, at least for that moment, they had been heard. The tension wasn't gone. Nothing that complicated could be solved with just words, but the situation didn't escalate into violence. The crowd began to disperse, the officers stood down, and the evening ended without incident. Simmons felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He'd done it. He'd helped prevent an escalation. But it wasn't just the officers or the protesters that had changed. It was him, too. He was beginning to truly believe in the idea of reform, not just in theory, but in practice. He understood now that the fight for justice and accountability was not about the end goal. It was about the commitment to progress, no matter how slow or painful it might be. As the crowd cleared and the officers began to leave the scene, Green approached Simmons. There was no sneer this time, just a quiet, reluctant respect. "You handled that well, Simmons," he said. "Maybe you're not as soft as I thought." Simmons met his gaze, his tone steady. "Maybe I'm just doing what's right." As the night wore on and the streets began to empty, Simmons stood in the quiet aftermath, reflecting on everything that had brought him here. He wasn't naive enough to think that one moment could change everything. He knew the challenges were far from over, But for the first time in a long while, he felt the glimmer of hope that the department and the city might just have a shot at something better. The road ahead would be long, but Simmons knew he wasn't walking it alone. The chief, his fellow officers, and the community were all part of the journey now. And together, they might just be able to build a future where trust, respect, and accountability weren't just words, but lived realities. And that was the start of real change. And that's the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support and small effort motivated us to create the next video. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section. We'll definitely read and reply to your comments. See you soon in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself and your family. Bye-bye.